Khartoum, capital of Sudan. The meeting point of the White Nile from the Great Lakes region and the Blue Nile from the Ethiopian highlands. Hamdi is a resident of Tuti Island, where the two Niles converge. He explains to his son the difference in the color of the waters. The White Nile on the left and the Blue Nile on the right, and how they join here to form one river flowing northwards to Egypt.
The most beautiful thing distinguishing us from the rest of the world is the Nile. There is no other river like it. It's a great river, heavenly, and the life around it is unique.
In his small truck, each day Hamdi delivers vegetables across the river to the market of Omdurman.
I live of the Nile. I take vegetables that grow here to the market. How would I live otherwise? I never move away. Even when we die, we'll be buried by the Nile.
Sudan's road to independence started in the middle of the 20th century. In 1953, Britain and Egypt, joint rulers over Sudan for more than 50 years, signed an agreement giving the Sudanese people the right to self-determination. 2 years later, in 1955, the Sudanese parliament unanimously adopted a declaration of independence, rather than unifying with Egypt into a single country. On January 1st, 1956, the Sudanese flag was raised for the first time in Khartoum. The largest country in Africa was born, a country forming 60% of the entire Nile Basin area. Sudan had enormous agricultural potential, but there was a drawback. The 1929 Anglo-Egyptian agreement allotted only 4 billion cubic meters of Nile waters to the Sudanese territory, compared to Egypt's 48 billion cubic meters. The newly independent Sudanese were not happy inheriting this colonial legacy.
This agreement reinforced Egyptian dominance over the Nile and gave Sudan just a token amount.
Most Sudanese believe that the Nile agreements were unjustly set and that distribution of the water should have been based on the size of the country. Sudan's share should have been much more than what was agreed upon because it's far larger.
The 1929 agreement had also given Egypt the right to monitor the Nile flow beyond Egyptian territory.
I
remember when I was a young engineer. I moved to the Sinnar Dam. My roommate was an Egyptian engineer, and his sole job was to check the amount of water Sudan took from the Nile and to ensure that Sudan didn't take water during the drought season.
Keen to assert its newly won sovereignty, the Sudanese government declared it was no longer bound by the 1929 agreement. By 1958, relations between Sudan and Egypt had deteriorated. Sudan's foreign minister traveled to Cairo for urgent meetings. The two peoples had often described themselves as brothers of the Nile Valley. But now there was a growing rift. But dramatic events in Khartoum brought a sudden end to tensions. In November 1958, the Sudanese army staged a coup d'etat, overthrowing the government. General Ibrahim Aboud took the reins of power. Looking back on events, some see the hand of then Egyptian President Jamal Abdel Nasser behind the coup.
Jamal Abdel Nasser liked military coups. And Lieutenant General Aboud was close to the Egyptian regime.
A year after the coup, a Sudanese delegation arrived in Cairo to sign a new Nile agreement. The 1959 full utilization of Nile waters agreement allocated a new share of the river ahead of the completion of the Aswan High Dam in Egypt. Once constructed, the dam was due to save over 30 billion cubic meters of floodwater annually. Egypt's share of the Nile increased by several billion cubic meters. Sudan's limited share more than quadrupled. The 1959 agreement between Egypt and Sudan consolidated a renewed alliance.
Egypt and Sudan formed a joint committee responsible for monitoring the river in the two countries and increasing its water flow.
One way to increase the Nile waters was to resurrect a plan dating back to British colonial times. Over 20 billion cubic meters of the Nile waters carried downstream from the Great Lakes region are lost by evaporation in the huge swamp area of southern Sudan known as the Sud. The plan was to dig a canal diverting the Nile to bypass this area, reducing the water loss. It was called the Jonglei Canal. There was one problem. Sudan was far from stable. The nation had been born with a dangerous fault line between a predominantly Arab and Muslim north and a mainly Christian and animist south. Chief Damian is a village leader on the outskirts of Juba, the capital of southern Sudan. He remembers the mood of secession in the south during the early 1950s.
We wanted to partner because we were used always by Arabs as second men in the government. We were cheated. We were cheated by the Arabs, not as Arabs. We were cheated badly. I'm not an Arab. I'm an African by origin. I'm an African.
In August 1955, the first Sudanese civil war erupted between north and south. Fighting raged for 17 years. Eventually, a peace accord was signed in 1972 in Addis Ababa. The end of fighting meant that plans for the Jonglei Canal in southern Sudan could now be brought back off the shelf. Egyptian President Anwar Sadat and his Sudanese counterpart Jafar el-Numeri did exactly this. And in 1978, work started on the 360-kilometer canal. But the southern Sudanese viewed the project with suspicion. The main tribes of the region, such as the Nuer and Dinka, made a living by grazing their cattle across the Sud. The Jonglei Canal threatened to dry up significant parts of this wetland. From the start, it proved harmful for the tribes and their livestock.
I know that when the Jonglei Canal was being opened, I was still a young man, and we saw stack of cattle coming from the east, going to the Nile to drink water. And they just went in and they perished because of the big bank that was open because of those machines.
A campaign against the Jonglei Canal project gained momentum, reaching far and wide.
The Jonglei Canal was met with a hostile campaign. I was Minister of Irrigation, and I received letters from Japan, from environmentalists, asking me why we would want to dry the wetlands in southern Sudan and create a desert. A letter from someone in Japan who wasn't even living here and had no rights to this water? It was part of the campaign of negativity aimed at creating instability in our area.
By the early 1980s, the project, almost two-thirds complete, had become the focus for suspicion and wild rumors.
Well, there was politics, and you know politicians can create stories to frighten people. One of them was that probably there were a lot of Egyptians coming to settle on the canal. That was not true, but of course, in the absence of proper information, anything could be believed.
Relations between the North and the South began to deteriorate once again. In 1983, a group of southern Sudanese soldiers mutinied, refusing to obey orders from their northern commanders. An officer by the name of John Garang joined the mutineers. He led them into the bush to start a guerrilla movement which came to be known as the Sudan People's Liberation Army, or SPLA.
The Sudan's People Liberation Army was not against the Jonglei Canal project as such. John Garang, the leader of SPLA, had written his PhD thesis, by the way, on the Jonglei Canal. His problem was not the project itself, but his complaint was the southern Sudan also needs water, and we will not just be satisfied a little bit.
The project provided one of the very first targets for the SPLA at the beginning of Sudan's second civil war between the North and the South. The canal's giant excavator lays in the spot where it dug its last hole, a rusting, destroyed wreck. The fighting lasted for 22 years. 2 million people died and 4 million became refugees. After a series of talks, a peace agreement ending the civil war was signed in January 2005 in Naivasha, Kenya. The accord stipulated a referendum to be held throughout southern Sudan on independence by January 2011. The referendum resulted in southern secession. A new country was born, and a new question arose. Would the new country abide by previous water agreements, allocating a share of the Nile flow? Even before the announcement of the referendum result, the opinion from the South was clear.
We must revise those agreements, because should Southern Sudan become a different state, then this must be revised, because Southern Sudan is no longer included in that agreement.
A new Nile Basin country in Africa rejecting the validity of old agreements. A new nation looking to secure its own share of the river's waters. Something similar has happened before. In the 1960s, with European colonial powers declining, a number of African nations gained their independence, among them upstream states on the River Nile. Soon after, they announced they would not abide by the 1929 Anglo-Egyptian Nile Agreement, which had given Egypt exclusive control of the river.
Article 14D of 1929 agreement, it states very clearly that no states shall be able to utilize the Nile River waters or the rivers feeding the Niles or the lakes which feeds the River Nile without the approval of the Egyptians, of the Egyptian government. That alone gives veto to Egypt over other riparian states.
The two agreements from the previous century, from 1929 and 1959, lie at the heart of today's struggle over the Nile. Egypt and Sudan, on one side, see the agreements as historical legacies to be maintained.
We must uphold agreements and treaties. This is a logic that applies to national borders too. You can't just change the borders of African countries because their demarcation had been ratified in pre-independence treaties. And so, you can't just demand new stipulations in the Nile agreements, especially since this is a crucial case relating to our livelihood. The Nile waters are such a case. Egypt doesn't have any other water source.
On the other side, upstream countries see the past agreements as colonial relics and demand their own rights to a share of the Nile waters.
We are all aware that the agreement on the usage of the Nile water was signed way back during the colonial time. And since then, a lot of things have happened, and therefore there was need to review the agreement itself on how the countries through which the Nile goes can benefit equitably.
In an effort to resolve the growing dispute, in 1999, the ministers of water resources from all the Nile Basin countries met here in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. The so-called Nile Basin Initiative was launched, aimed at promoting joint projects and reaching a new agreement over the sharing of the Nile. But the mood of camaraderie at the initial meetings soon changed.
I'd like it to be known that the relationship between us and them wasn't that amicable. They believed we were taking all of the water and that they were getting nothing. When we went for meetings in those countries, they would say, "You're taking our water." I don't want to say it was a hostile atmosphere, but it certainly wasn't friendly.
The upstream countries accused Egypt of digging in its heels by refusing to consider relinquishing the agreements from the previous century. Negotiations continued over 10 years. Attitudes hardened, positions became ever more entrenched. The Egyptians saw their share of the river flow as both negligible and non-negotiable.
The amount of rainfall in the entire Nile Basin area is 1.6 trillion cubic meters. But what arrives downstream is 84 billion cubic meters only, which means less than 5%. So where does the difference go? It's wasted in evaporation, in swamps, in forests, and it is not used in upstream countries. Therefore, we should put aside this small quantity, which is less than 5%, leave it aside, and focus on building joint projects between the Nile Basin countries. This will save part of the lost water. Then we can divide it in a fair way between the 10 basin countries.
The upstream countries rejected Egyptian arguments. Ethiopia was one of the countries which, after years of being caught up in internal strife and tragedy, was now pushing more forcefully for a greater share of the Nile.
Rainfall is not entitled here to be negotiated because this is based on the nature, and it is a green water, and green water is not negotiated in any international agreement. That's why Ethiopia is demanding the Nile water as well, all waters within its territory is its natural resources, and that natural resources the resource of every Ethiopian people.
Things reached a head in May 2010 at a meeting in Entebbe, Uganda, when 4 upstream nations signed a new agreement, nullifying older ones and setting out policies for a more equitable share of the Nile. To this date, 6 countries are signatories: Ethiopia, Uganda, Rwanda, Tanzania, Kenya, and Burundi. Egypt and Sudan were absent, having refused to even attend the meeting. There was a mood of celebration among those who signed the so-called Nile Cooperative Framework Agreement.
I want to congratulate ourselves as countries of the riparian for having come this far. I know some of us are not there, but it requires even more concerted effort to make sure that we are all on board.
The signatories believe Egypt and Sudan will have to come on board at some point and sign the new agreement.
All the time they walk out, but they still come back because there is no any other source that they can be able to use. And what we have been telling them, the only simple way is cooperation.
With constructive recommendations.
Sure enough, a few weeks later, in June 2010, the Egyptians returned to the negotiating table. It was a bitter pill for them to swallow. However, they have yet to sign the Entebbe Agreement. For the Egyptians, at least for the time being, facts on the ground are more important than the signing of any accord.
Egypt and certain neutral parties believe that we don't need to sign any agreement at the present time, that there is no need for a framework agreement for the foreseeable future. We believe what is important is what is happening on the ground, especially the fact that there are no big dam projects at the present time that may affect Egyptian interests.
But the status quo is unlikely to hold. African upstream nations are increasingly demanding a larger share of the Nile waters. Such demands are raising fears downstream. Fears stoked up by a history of suspicion and rivalry. Fears about countries not only on the Nile, but even beyond the great river itself.